Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. As I said just a couple minutes ago, my name is Jay Schmidt, and I will be presenting today's webinar on electrodermal activity editing. Um, so yeah, thank you for those that have joined. Uh, what we're going to be going over today is sort of a comprehensive walkthrough on how to analyze skin conductance, also known as electrodermal activity. Um, and what we're going to do is we're going to have a 60-minute sort of prepared presentation that I have for you all, and then we're going to follow that up with 30 minutes of live Q&A. So I'm going to go through just some sort of housekeeping things before we get started. Just working through Zoom for those of you that are not completely familiar. Um, we do have a mute version here, and also to show you that sometimes during a Zoom session, you can actually see that your speakers are connected, or that Zoom thinks your speakers are actually a monitor if your monitor can produce sound. So uh, clicking that little uptick arrow and then ensuring that that you have the speakers selected if you can't hear me. Then we also have a Q&A function here, so please feel free to ask questions as they come to you. I have a sort of panel of people here waiting to accept the questions. They're going to confirm that you asked the question, we received it. We're going to put it into um, a sheet that we have, and then I'll try to address as many of those as I can at the end of the session during that Q&A portion. For those questions that do not get answered today, we will certainly follow up after the webinar and handle those on a case-by-case basis with you. Okay, I just wanted to give you some materials here that could be helpful when first getting started in addition to this webinar, and a couple marketing things that I want to show you. So first is just our support site. You can see there the address at the top left. This is a very nice way in which you can kind of get started and oriented with a lot of these measures, from collecting them to analyzing. Creating support cases is easy as logging in and clicking on that support case option here. And then we also do have other training options such as one-on-one, remotely. We actually have events as well that we would be very happy to invite you to. So you can kind of keep up to date with the different things that we're doing at MindWare. We have a quarterly newsletter letting you know essentially what we have done in the last 3 months, what's kind of coming up, new features, different software releases, events that we might be going to, and then, of course, future webinar announcements. So this is a nice way that you can kind of keep up to date, get an email when these things come out without having to sort of, recheck in with our site to see if there's any changes. And this right here, I would like to put a lot of attention into. We're actually having our annual seminar. This is sort of the much more advanced version of everything that we'll be covering today. And it's a great experience here. We're having it in Columbus, Ohio. I believe it's on the 8th and 9th of August. So we actually have a few more spots open up. So if anybody is interested, please reach out to us. There's also information about the actual seminar and a sign-up sheet and everything on our support site. So if you actually go to the training events that you see here, that link and all that information is provided to you there. And yeah, just as far as going into this a little bit more, this is a really good experience. We actually have our academic advisors there, sort of presenting on the scientific background and underpinnings of psychophysiology, sort of why we're collecting the measures, what is the behavioral interpretation, that sort of scientific foundation component. And then we'll also be doing a live data acquisition and analysis. It's a really good opportunity to sort of go from start to finish. So it really can be helpful for anybody from an undergraduate, sort of brand new to psychophysiology, new to laboratory, sort of getting those fundamentals, before you actually learn all the laboratory specific protocols and things like that, all the way up to postdocs and even collaborators that are potentially looking to update their sort of psychophysiological background to assist with other studies. So it's a really nice experience you can see here, in addition to sort of networking opportunities. And we'll actually be doing multiple measures, which can certainly save from having to go to multiple sessions here. So Again, going through the training a little bit more, if you click on this link here, we have online sessions, we have seminars. We can actually come out to your university to host them. Um, and yeah, if just so everyone's aware here as well, if your laboratory has paid for online training with us before, you are eligible for our complimentary 1 hour sessions. And this is also found in that training link there. Within the actual support site, you'll see that there is a training guide section right on that main page. Going into that, you can actually see that there are these articles that we have here that can sort of bring you from the beginning to end of the introduction to the measures, acquiring and analyzing the data. Okay, so I want to walk you just through a couple of different options here and services that MindWare has, just in case everyone's not familiar with them. First thing here is just a somewhat typical data collection analysis workflow. So starting from the left here on number one, we can actually see that we're able to acquire data from a lot of different sources. So an example here, we have the MindWare Mobile, which wirelessly pairs with our Field Laboratory Integration Platform, or FLIP for short. This is a way in which we can house the networking, a panel zoom camera. We can actually take this out to participant homes. It's small enough to fit on the sort of carry-on bag on an airplane, so it's a really nice pairing between the two. But in addition to this sort of physiology, audio, video collection system, we also compare our systems with other modalities. So such as like the Tobii eye tracking, we can this is a very nice combo between the three that can automatically synchronize with our system. And then we can imagine we're walking through these different workflows of likely using the audio video information to pipe it into a behavioral coding scheme, such as the Interact software from Mangold, you can see here. Once we're actually putting those event markers in of all of the sort of affective behavioral changes, we'll create an event file which can be directly imported into our analysis. So if we had questions such as a dyadic interaction between mom and child, for example, one situation we might want to know is what is the child's physiological reaction every time mom looks away? Or if we're doing something like strange situation paradigm where mom actually leaves, stranger comes into the room, for instance, we can actually code every time that those occurs and those little micro behaviors, and then we can actually ask questions physiologically, as I just said, something like, what is the effect of this specific event on a participant's physiology? Um, we can then, in a somewhat separate stream, we can bring eye tracking data into something like Tobii Pro's analysis software. We can use the same function of once we actually have these events in our file created in ProLab, we can export those event files and directly load them into our analysis again. So by using these different features and these different software here and being able to import their data, we can really save a lot of time and ask some questions in a sort of multimodal fashion, if you will. Couple new features I want to harp on real quick is we actually have developed an integration cable between the CNAP. So this is a periodic blood pressure monitor, and this will actually can be controlled by Biolab now. So for those of you looking to sort of dip your toes into blood pressure, this is a great monitor to begin with. And yeah, if you're interested in sort of getting that and synchronizing it with the different physiologies, certainly let us know. But this is a new function that we're all pretty excited about here. So um, another thing we have is Study Compiler, which is going to be coming out soon here. This is a brand new software that we're going to be releasing in which we can, sort of add another layer of pre-processing data before our statistical compiler programs, such as SPSS-R or SAS, for example. But essentially what we can do is we can load a lot of different files at once. We can enter unique IDs for specific files. And then right within the software, we can actually say like specific portions or epochs of the data that we're interested in. So even though the entire session may have been coded, for example, the baseline, task, and recovery, we can break that up to ask questions such as what was the physiology and all these different outputs for just task two, for example. So it's a really nice way in which we can organize these data, preparing it for our output file. Again, that can be loaded into these different stats packages in a very sort of efficient manner. Next thing I want to talk about is our professional data analysis service. So we actually have a team of people here that will actually meet with you to understand your data, your study, do a review of it, request some example files, and we'll actually go and clean the data ourselves. We leave very copious specific notes on every data edit, why it was made. And yeah, so essentially this is a way in which we can offload what we're going to be learning a little bit about today onto us. So for those of you who are interested, please, reach out to our sales team and we can sort of start this process and just give you some preliminary information how this works a little bit further. Okay, so actually going into the content for today, as far as editing the data here, just want to go through some helpful tips here on how we're actually storing the data. We recommend that you usually have a unique folder for every participant. This is certainly your option when acquiring the data, but it does usually lend a hand easier to looking at the data later on, as there are subfolders that are created underneath the master one. So for example, we have our stress study here and a different folder for each participant. So when we actually acquire the data, we're going to place the MWI and MWX files into that folder. And in addition to that, when we actually export the data to our output file, which is a XLSX Excel file, this folder is created by our software and it'll place it underneath that. And then if we actually make any edits to the file during our analysis component, we have an edited data file that will also be created. So it is nice that these sort of subfolders are created underneath the participant folder. If you have all of your participants for a study underneath the same folder, that's fine. It just is a little bit easier again when we're doing some further analysis to have these subfolders organized. As far as different file structures, every time we acquire data with BioLab, with our system, you're going to have two files that are created. One is the MWI, that's an index file. That's the actual file we're going to load and do analysis on. And we have the MWX, which is a raw data file. So these two MWI and MWX files are really companion files. They should always stay together. If you're going to send data to somebody, certainly send both. The idea here is that if something were to happen to the file, such as Windows crashes, for example, the file that you have loaded could become corrupted. And so what we do is we actually have all our raw data always safe here in the MWX. And when we do analysis, we're only loading the MWI. This is essentially indexing the information from the MWX without making any changes to it. So if anything were to happen to the file, such as corruption or otherwise, we can actually delete the MWI, load the MWX, recreate the MWI, and we're good to go without any sort of data loss. So that is the idea behind the sort of companion dual file structure. These other files that you see here, I do want to show because they are temporary files. So when we actually load an MWI, if you return to that folder that you're loading the data from, you'll see these SHM and WAL files. These are just temporary files that are only opened when we're actually actively loading an analysis session. And they should disappear as soon as we close that out. If, let's say, again, something crashes within your PC or the actual Windows application, Explorer, what have you, these files may remain afterwards, and so in those cases you can delete them. They really have no effect on everything. So great. And then another thing we're going to see here is user preferences. This is going to save things such as channel mappings to make it a little bit easier the second time we load a file. Examples like that I'll show in a second. And of course we have the EDH, that sort of edited data file. This is the EDH, so this is actually what it would look like for our heart rate variability. But for for skin conductance, it's going to be EDI. So same sort of ED structure there. And then again, as I talked about before, we have our output file. It's going to put the date that you did that, and along with the participant information and when the session was collected. Okay, great. So I'm actually going to go into some identification for skin conductance and components of this before we look into some actual analysis sessions that I have prepared for you. So one thing is we're going to be looking at is skin conductance, its sort of level overall, whatever that sort of baseline skin conductance level that a participant might have. So this is something we might notice during our actual baseline period before the sort of condition begins for your experiment. So the actual kind of level that they're at is something that we can look at. Another more popular thing is, or in addition to this, a popular thing would be to look at something called SCRs, or skin conductance responses. So these, in addition to the overall level change, are these sort of spontaneous sympathetic activation periods in which we see a rise and fall in the signal due to the conductance of sweat. So if we had the sensors on, like, say, on our hands to collect these sort of different sweat activation, the sweat is pumped out of the little pores in our hands, and then it's received by our sensors. And more sort of sweat in that area, more sweat that's been pumped out of those little pores, the higher the conductance is going to be for that signal. And so what we can see is in sort of these spontaneous little moments is these rises in skin conductance that will, in most cases, come back down to a baseline point. And so these are actually known as SCRs. And yeah, so in looking at these things, we can actually also implement a stimulus presentation. So if we're going to say that there was something that preceded that SCR before that rise, we could say that that was an event-related skin conductance response. And so if we imagine the stimulus that occurs here at time zero, normally there's about a 1 to 3 second window in latency, and then we can start to detect these SCRs. And if we have one that falls within that window, and we can then correlate it to the stimulus that was just delivered before that. Great. Other things just to talk about here, in addition to those I just mentioned, is the actual half recovery point that is helpful to know about. So what this does in time is looks from the sort of beginning, the trough of that SCR to the maxima, and then in time, how long it took for that signal to come back down to the sort of halfway point between the two, or the 50% mark. So the reason why we're doing this is because this entire period is known as the phasic component of skin conductance. So within there, we have two things. We have the sort of phasic and tonic periods. And during the actual phasic component, that's sort of that sympathetic activation. And then, so that'll actually occur from the trough all the way to the half recovery point. This will sort of area under the curve here will all be that phasic component. From the half recovery point to the next skin conductance response is known as the tonic period. And so, yeah, anyways, this is a way in which we can identify one specific SCR and differentiate it from ones that follow. So as I just talked about here, we have our tonic skin conductance level here. We can see it on the screen where this is represented. And so for this segment, for these 60 seconds in this case, the tonic skin conductance level here is what we're seeing outside of that range. So as I just showed you before, we can look at this first SCR exemplified here, sort of the trough marking that onset before the upward inflection. This second one, so it's a sort of square, if you can see. The second one here in this case is a circle showing that peaks or that maxima of the amplitude of that SCR. And then once it finally does fall back down to its half point, we're actually going to place an X there. And so the area from the trough location to the half recovery point, this is all known as the phasic period. So essentially from this first solid to this dashed line. And then outside of that, so from the half recovery to the next trough, this is all going to be known as the tonic period, sort of when they're not having any of that phasic reaction or sympathetic activation, if you will. So if we were looking at tonic skin conductance level, this would be taking the average of all the time here between these different SCRs. Another thing you might notice is something called a compound SCR. This is one that is identified here in white, in which we can actually see that there is the trough, the rise, and then we don't actually have that X, right? We don't have that half recovery point because we had another skin conductance response that occurred within that window. This is perfectly normal. It is just something to be aware of in these cases because we might not have that period. So for this example here, as far as the phasic versus tonic period, we would actually say from this first trough all the way to this half recovery point here, this entire area was known as a phasic period. But anyways, going back to this idea here of the tonic level and period, this is just different things we can look at between the two. The tonic period and SEL aren't reported as commonly as the mean skin conductance response and just how many SCRs occurred within there. This is in large part due to the fact that in some cases when our data are not very clean, they're not sort of they could be from poor electrode contact if we had a lot of movement in our study, especially for collecting data from the kiddos. In a lot of cases, these specific points are not easy to identify, and thus, if we aren't looking to even report on skin conductance responses because we can't see these points very clearly, sort of the backup and most common metric of this is the mean skin conductance level. So, including the tonic and phasic periods there, what is the mean level here? And so, looking at this between sessions or between people, we're going to see we have our baseline mean skin conductance. We can sort of aggregate all those different sections between there, get a overall average, and then we're just going to do change scores between that and then let's say the condition. So mean skin conductance there, mean skin conductance there, and then potentially even comparing that to a recovery afterwards. Um, Just wanted to show another component of here with the rolling filter. I'm going to show how to adjust the rolling filter in a little bit, but it is sort of nice to see it at this point here. The rolling filter, we have an article that I will reference later, but what this is doing is sort of a window in which it's going to be moving through the data and smoothing out anything that is very unlikely to be an actual skin conductance response, if you will. So as it will affect the overall amplitude just slightly, it's usually insignificant. What it is doing is removing any sort of erroneous detections of potential SCRs. So as I was talking about before, we could even identify this as this bottom right one being more of a cleaner signal, but let's say that our signal looked more like the one that is behind that. This rolling filter can help clean that up so we're not getting sort of misidentifying motion artifacts or messy data as potential SCRs. So these things that are occurring too frequently, sort of back to back to back, these things can occur without any sort of rolling filter applied. So you can see here what was very likely only one SCR was being initially misidentified as three here. So very helpful function. We definitely recommend it for everybody that is looking to report on any sort of metric with um, skin conductance, but certainly for those that are interested in reporting on SCRs, this is a very sort of crucial step. I will show you this setting and our recommendations for it in just a little bit, but certainly helpful to make sure that you have that turned on and set to the correct setting. So we actually see this smoother sort of cleaned up signal that we see on the bottom right. Okay, so actually go into the calibration settings a little bit here. So the microsiemen threshold. So this microsiemen identified here, this little u big S, is our electrical conductance uh, sort of metric here. And so as far as a skin conductance response, so again, those are little spontaneous responses. What is the threshold at which we're actually saying this isn't motion artifact, this isn't something due to respiration necessarily. It's an actual, psychologically driven phasic response here. And so 0.05 and above, if we see any sort of one of those hills that occur in which the amplitude is 0.05 above from the sort of trough location, we're going to say that's a skin conductance response. This is pretty ubiquitous in the sense that this 0.05 is used in most research studies. Some will use different thresholds such as 0.03 or all the way up to 0.07. I think in a lot of cases it's more important to just find consistency through your study and ensuring that we're, referencing a very high impact factor journal on which, we can reference as to why we're using that threshold. But as far as our recommendation, 0.05 would be that. And then we can look into the actual skin conductance responses that are due to that event. So if we remember in the previous example, which I'll bring back up here, we actually had a stimuli that an event that occurred here, and this could be driven from a presentation program. Let's say you're using SuperLab or ePrime or CyclePy. We're actually presenting images and videos to these people. We can code specific times within those events, and then it would send, like, let's say, a pulse to MindWare saying this is exactly the millisecond that they saw this image. And then we can say that if there was something that we thought would evoke physiological reaction, then we could look for that latency and then say this again, this SCR was due to that. So in those cases, those are event-related SCRs, and this is setting that window. If you remember, I said at time zero, the actual event occurs. There's a natural latency within our physiology before that sweat can actually be pumped out of that pore. It's a very slow measure. And so we would actually say that any SCRs that occur about 1 to 3 seconds afterwards are going to be event related or ER-SCRs. Okay, other settings here to just show are the calculation windows. So I will show this sort of pre-segmentation as we go into events and modes in just a second. But this is a sort of an additional way to break down the data within a segment. So for example, let's say that we had a 60-second segment that we're analyzing this data in, but we also wanted to look for any sort of skin conductance level changes throughout that 60-second segment. So we can turn that calculation method onto something like, let's say, 5-second windows, and then we will actually get another output result book that will show those changes throughout that segment. And here's the rolling filter that I showed you before. So definitely want to make sure that we have this turned on. And as far as the block size, we would recommend that that number matches the sampling rate of your acquisition hardware. So once again, once I crack open the actual analysis application, I'll show you how we can actually view that sampling rate if you're not aware of it. But this is a great starting point, sort of matching that sampling rate so we don't see any phase shifts in the data. In some cases where our data are very messy, we can increase this to something like about twice the size is usually our maximum that we recommend. This will help remove any sort of copious, motion artifacts that we may have in our data while still allowing us to use it. And so if we saw something like a very large amount of skin dentist responses that we weren't expecting, we can increase our block to sort of normalize those data in a certain sense. Okay, and just a couple rules here. So for those of you that have sort of attended these previous webinars or are somewhat familiar with the different rules and recommendations we have, there's quite a few for the heart rate variability. There's a little bit less for impedance, and there's even less for skin conductance. As you'll see here as I'm going through these different examples and showing techniques, and even during the Q&A portion here, there's just less activity around it as far as rules and how we should edit these data. There's a wide variety of different techniques that people have available out there in the sort of research atmosphere. And so it's a little bit difficult in some cases to find which one should we stick to. Our general overall rule or recommendation for this all would be do as little as possible. Over editing skin conductance data is very common, but the effects of doing such can certainly increase the likelihood that we don't see the effect that was actually there, or and then sort of study replication issues by using different protocols. So doing as little as possible can help with that sort of correlation to those other studies and keeping consistency internally. If we have multiple raters that are cleaning these data, and we're looking to report on skin conductance responses, this would become somewhat tricky to make sure everyone's on the same page. We want to make sure everyone's making the same sort of decisions on the data set. And as we over edit the skin conductance data, you'll see that it's very high or very hard to have a higher intraclass correlation coefficient would be a good way to look at that sort of agreements and edits, and it would be high to sort of or difficult to keep that at a high level when we're over editing these data. So that's the general overall rule here. But with some light recommendations, we would normally say looking at these data in 30 to 60-second segments is ideal. Normally, groups will be looking at the other physiological measures such as heart rate variability and impedance in that same window. And so usually matching that is the most helpful thing to be done. As far as how small of an epoch, what is the minimum amount of time that I could look at a segment? Again, there's not a perfect rule in this. As we saw before, the this sort of looking at a skin interest response, the latency is about 1 to 3 seconds after an event could occur. Then we also have our half recovery point, which varies a little bit to encapsulate something like that entire SCR. If that's what our point was, we're looking at event related, and I want to see just the SCR afterwards. Normally, that's about a 10-second window. Again, there are some error bars on this because there's some variance on different genetic makeups from people, the different studies you're doing, different sort of conductance of how much sweat one might produce just naturally. But about a 10-second window is usually the minimum to do such a thing. The absolute minimum that we've kind of ever seen and we would recommend is something about a 4 or 5 second window. But again, that's going to exclude a lot of those SCRs, at least not the entire cycle of it. So, but again, yeah, no, normally looking at 30-second segments is ideal. I will show you a method in which it might be ideal to look at something more like 5 minutes all at once. But we'll go through that once we actually look at the skin conductance responses analysis component of this. And then bottom here, right, we see that as far as the extrapolation and data retention component, we're going to try to estimate or extend these data less than 40% for a segment. Now, there are a lot of different variables that might go into this to say, let's never do this, let's never estimate or extend. We're going to do this more or less for a specific study, but this is just our sort of general rule on that. And then we definitely would not recommend doing any of these features or these functions, I'm sorry, if we're looking to report on skin conductance responses. And we'll see this in just a second, but the idea here is that if we were to somewhat arbitrarily pick a point that we say, let's remove this data because it's due to motion artifact, we wouldn't know if by removing that stream of data that we're not also removing skin conductance responses. So by doing these features, we're actually going to underestimate the amount of SCRs that we report. So a little confusing to think about at this point here, but it's just helpful to sort of get a general idea of our rules and recommendations, and then it'll make more sense in just a minute here. Okay, and then just a general slide here. This equipment, the analysis, and also the hardware that MindWare makes is not to be used for diagnosis, treatment, or prevention of any disease states in humans and animals. The acquisition hardware that we make is actually designed specifically without FDA clearance so that we're sort of not on the hook for any sort of thing like this, but in addition to it also on purpose not being used for these sort of research functions here. So just something to kind of be aware of when we're making these interpretations, and especially if we're providing any sort of feedback to our participants. Something that might be common is how do I look? How healthy am I? So sort of, staying away from that knee-jerk reaction of, oh yeah, everything looks great, or, you have an issue here that's sort of in that zone of, stating that this is for research purposes only, and these sort of clinical interpretations cannot be made from it is a very helpful stance and statement. Okay, so at this point here, I'm actually going to jump out of my prepared PowerPoint. I'm going to open up our software and go through a couple examples with everybody. Again, in about 20 minutes or so, we're going to start with the Q&A portion, and then we can kind of drive it from there. Okay, great. So first thing I have prepared here is I'm actually going to open up our software. You can see that I've already loaded a file, but I will sort of start from the beginning for everybody to show the initial setup here. So first thing I have is I actually have my demo file. I can load this, and you will notice, I'm actually going to jump back, sorry, that in doing this, the filter here that it's looking for is only for the MWI files. As I said before, this is the one we're going to load. If I turn this off, we can actually see the MWX is present in the folder. Again, that's that raw data, but we just don't actually load it. So anyways, we're going to load that MWI file. And we haven't made any edits to our file, so we're going to leave that on new. And then as far as the channel mapping, we're going to just go across and highlight at the very minimum the required channels for this measure. So we can see here that the electrodermal activity has a lot of names. It has EDA, EDR, GSC, GSR, the actual skin conductance. And so just familiarizing ourselves with that and knowing that they're all different is very helpful. So electrodermal activity, we've chosen in our acquisition software to call that galvanic skin conductance. So it may be nicer if we actually call it EDA in the acquisition side. But regardless, we're going to come across here and we're going to select from our list the skin conductance session here. One important thing that we're going to look at in a little bit is that we do have these skin conductance responses, which can be purely psychological in nature. One problem with this is the our respiratory system is very thankfully innervated with our sympathetic nervous system. But one of the problems is when looking at SCRs is that we can actually have respiration-driven skin conductance responses. So if we actually breathe in deep enough or we have a very large sniff, 1 to 3 seconds later, we can actually see an SCR occurs. And so having respiration, a synchronized respiration with our skin conductance responses crucial and it's really mandatory if we're looking to report on SCRs because we need to be able to differentiate the two, identify respiration or respiratory driven SCRs, remove that effect, and yeah, so you'll need to kind of control for respiration in a certain sense. If you used a system that did not collect respiration, you can certainly still report and look at the electrodermal activity, but it would be something to where you would only want to look at skin conductance level, for example. So that mean skin conductance for, let's say, your baseline and the mean skin conductance for your condition. We're looking at change scores, but not reporting on anything like SCRs because we don't know how many were, just sort of organically created, um, sort of behaviorally, and those that may be due to a respiration that the participant took. So in this case, I have mapped the Z0 and DZDT. These are waveforms collected from impedance cardiography. Impedance cardiography has a sort of benefit of also being able to extract respiration. So in this case, this specific study, we didn't need to put a respiration belt on them because we can derive it from impedance. So anyways, that's kind of what I've done across here. We do have a respiration channel. This would be only used if we had a respiration belt. So if we didn't have impedance, we could map that there. I'm going to hit OK. When I go to the calibration settings, you can see that it does have a respiration signal to use. When we put in Z0 into that field, it knows, okay, well, let's derive respiration from the Z0. If we didn't have that filled in, we had the respiration belt put in there. This would be highlighted and we could select that there, but that's kind of the idea here. Last thing I want to show in this before we jump back into some different modes here is the block size as identified before. One of the helpful things is to know, well, what should this be set to? And again, our recommendation is to match the sampling rate of your device. Again, if you don't know what that is, then you can always, once you load the file, you can head up to the setting here and look at the file info. And then you can see here the sampling frequency for skin conductance was done at 500. So that is our starting point recommendation for that session here. And if our sampling rate was 500, 1,000 would be the maximum that we would recommend. Again, this is every sort of block increase that we do is smoothing the data a little bit more. So use it with caution if you're going to go, sort of change from our recommendation. Okay, so I'm not going to spend too much time going through the actual events and modes and how they could be used in every sense here. If there are if there's something you want me to drill into a little bit further, certainly this is a nice use for a question that you might want to ask, and then during that last 20 or 30 minutes, we can actually dissect that a little bit further. And I will show you a couple of things that are helpful for skin conductance. So before we get into time mode, which is how we're going to look at most of this, there is an event function here, which isn't commonly used with our different analyses, but is somewhat more prominent for skin conductance. So if we imagine that we have these different events, so some of these are identifying different parts of the study, so starting the task and ending the task, so on and so forth. And some of these potentially could be just sort of behavioral in nature. So these are events that we could be placing live, or they could be events that we're adding afterwards because we have a video that's synchronized. And so in this cases, we can actually see like if there was some sort of physiological event that occurred around those. So usually something like a cough or there's a door slam or something that's not part of the protocol. That's not what we normally want to pick up on. But if there was something such as the beginning of a start of a task, let's say that task was something like a startle protocol, they're seeing some sort of shocking image, or we're sort of acoustically startling them. We could take it over here and we could say something like, show me the beginning of this task here. Sorry, here. I'm going to go from event source. So the task one, and then we can look at something like before and after that event. So if we looked at something, like I said, about some period before, so we could look at something like 10 seconds before an event occurs, and then 10 seconds afterwards. And we're going to split at that exact event. So what this is going to do is going to create two segments for us. Again, one 10 seconds before, one 10 seconds afterwards. We can use that pre-event period as, let's say, a baseline for this actual event over here, and then we can look at the change scores between the two. So I'm going to show this real quickly here. We have the 10 seconds before. Here's our task one onset. And so we could do something like at a very basic level, what is the mean skin conductance for this segment? And then jumping forward, we can see that same task one start. So then essentially this is the 10 seconds afterwards. So what we can do here is we can actually say, here's the mean level. We didn't have any SCRs. And then once the actual event occurs, we have an SCR that occurs right away, and we have a change in the level. So one way in which that mode could be used. Um, and yeah, so anyways, there are a lot of different ways we can use these data, but just for the sake of this webinar, that's kind of the most I'm going to show with most of the events. I will identify an event-related SCR here in just a second, but most of what we're going to be doing is going to stay in time mode just to make it a little bit easier on us. So I'm going to actually hit the Analyze button and jump into this to show different components, and we'll actually start cleaning a few of these data sets. So as you can see here, as I showed you before, we have the different SCRs identified with these different colors and the different sort of square, circle, and X points here. And as we can actually click along to look at these a little bit closer if necessary. But they're different colors just identifying different SCRs. So again, the sort of onset of an SCR being this trough sort of square location, the peak, the highest point being that circle identified, and then that half recovery point right here. So again, if sort of tonic versus phasic components of this, the tonic period would be this area from about 0 to 2, from about 2 to 7. The area under that curve would be phasic, both in time and amplitude. And then from the half recovery point to the next trough, this is all going to be tonic. So if we're looking at the sort of tonic components here, that's how we identify them once again. The sort of mean skin conductance here, and you can see this change. So I actually am going to just really briefly turn on this method to about 10 seconds intervals of that calculation method. And now we can see that we have the mean skin conductance for this first segment here being identified. And as I change this up, so segment 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, we can actually look at that mean level change as we're going through there. So it's not just a visualization that we might make an interpretation on, but again, it actually provides that output of the difference in all of these windows. So if that's helpful for you, that's how you turn that on. Okay, so anyways, as far as looking at this data, what we would do about it, the waveform, the actual morphology of what this should look like is just like this. So there's going to be variance for every participant in the study you're looking at. However, it should be this, in most cases, is sort of like slow rolling hills, very smooth structure that we're seeing here. If there's a lot of jaggedness to the signal, that's usually indicative of something like motion artifact, could be due to the acquisition hardware itself, or most likely it is due to the electrodes being dried out. So let's certainly make sure that our sensors are not dried out. But in those cases, regardless of what it is, there's usually something that needs to be done before we process that further, especially if we're looking to report on SCRs. But in general, this is the normal sort of architecture that we should see in the signal. And then as far as looking at the respiration, we can see that waveform in this portal here. And so we're going to go through this in a little bit here with the different examples, but I will, in this example, show you how we would actually differentiate the two types of SCRs, those being psychologically driven with those that are strictly just due to a respiration, a very large respiration. So in this case here, what we're looking for are these respirations that usually in the order of 2 or 3 times the magnitude of anything else on the screen. So In these cases here, if we pick this one being the sort of largest respiration, is it 2 to 3 times as large as the surrounding ones? No, it's just barely a little bit larger, so we don't have to concern ourselves with it. But in further examples here, we will see that there is sort of a spontaneous large respiration that is certainly in that criteria of being about 2 or 3 times in the total magnitude, being from trough to peak here compared to these. And so we just want to look at this a little bit closer to see if this particular change, again, about 1 to 3 seconds afterwards, falls within that window of this respiration. So we're going to hit the Edit Peaks and Troughs section here. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at the different points between these. So actually focusing on the trough location. So my respiration, actually turn this to something a little bit easier maybe to see, is that pink. So what we're going to do is we can move these X cursors to this trough location. You can grab the X cursors by clicking on this tool right here. So right before they actually start to take that deep breath in, and then we can take a second cursor and we can place it at where that actual skin conductor response occurred. So we can see that being the red line here, there's that trough location before it goes up. And then again, here's our other X cursor on the onset of that respiration. So by doing that as two right there at those locations, the delta point for the X cursors is the absolute time between them. So, and remember, if there's going to be a skin conductance response, it's usually about a 1 to 3 second latency. So if I were to take a breath here at this point, about 187 seconds in, then 1 to 3 seconds later, if there is an SCR, it could be correlated to that respiration. So in this case, we are actually below that window that we would find acceptable by quite a bit. So this is so it's 525 milliseconds. So it's about half of the latency window that we'd be expecting. So looking for this kind of thing, detecting trough to trough location, how much time can really help us identify that. Again, it's not a perfect science here, and you'll see a lot of different variants in how people will recommend this, but it's a general rule that's very helpful. So identifying these large respirations and looking at the difference between those two is very helpful. And later on, we can see another example of that. So we have two very large respirations here, at least relative to the other ones. So we would definitely want to focus on this segment a little bit closer. And we can kind of use our tool, our X cursor tool function to help walk through this. So again, I'm going to pick up on the trough location of our pink respiration waveform, and then I'm going to put this window here to sort of get the onset of this SCR. And we can see now actually from the point of that trough, or I'm sorry, from the trough of the respiration to the point of the SCR trough, the delta is actually showing us, yes, it is more than a second. It is between that 1 to 3 second window. So what we should do in these cases is delete that corresponding SCR. So we can do that by clicking on the delete function here. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to encapsulate the trough location for that SCR and the peak. And then this effects have been removed from the actual count of how many SCRs are occurring. And then we would want to continue to do the same thing for this other even larger respiration that occurred here. So I'm going to again focus on that this point of the respiration and then the sort of trough location here. And we can see that unfortunately this one is also looking like it was in that window. So we can go ahead and remove both the trough and peak of that SCR. You can see here we have what is a compound SCR. They didn't have to have recovery point. So this is something that we would want to also investigate due to this respiration to make sure it's not within that 3 second window, again, 1 to 3. And we can see here it's very far out from that 3 second window here, so we can go ahead and leave that one alone. Okay, so and just to go over a couple different ideas here between doing this. So you can see here that we have a very large SCR due to this respiration here, and it does take it quite some time to return sort of down to, if we imagine this is a sort of a normative baseline for them, around 6.5. So by having this very large respiration, it is increasing the total mean skin conductance level. Sorry, I have my intervals off. But most importantly, we find that most of the SCRs are not statistically significant as far as the amplitude. So if we were to look at this segment, we do have an increase of about 1 microsiemen, which let's say was mostly due to that respiration. But if we take this and we actually, are including this with every segment for that condition, let's say we have like 10, 20 segments, then it is usually very insignificant statistically that we see those changes. This is a very extreme example in which we wouldn't expect normally to see that much of a change. But yeah, anyways, in some cases, we want to be conscientious of this, and if we're going to be looking at something like tonic skin conductance level. So in these changes here, when we're by removing these actual points here, we are saying this is a tonic period, at which we're not having those functions there, which is could be fine here. But just identifying that comparing to this phasic component here, did we actually want to do that? Is this truly a tonic period? Those are things that need to come into consideration if we're looking to report on tonic SCL and tonic periods. So you can see here that's why, in addition to the SCRs, mean skin conductance is kind of the preferred one because it doesn't have so much of an effect from spontaneous, respiration-driven SCRs. Is also less susceptible to any sort of motion artifacts that the participant might have um, gone through. So anyways, just some considerations there when we have these kind of changes, but this would be a proper editing technique for this specific segment here. So one more example here of the respiration potential driven artifact, and then we'll look at different data sets for different components that'd be happening. So again, I'm going to drop this first X cursor, I'm sorry, over this trough of this respiration that is quite larger than the surrounding ones. And I'm going to do the same thing with this second one here over the trough location. It is falling within that window. So once again, we would want to delete both the peak and trough for that SCR. Okay, so the next thing that we can look at here is just when do we actually want to remove the mean skin conductance level change of this potentially respiration-driven artifact. So again, like if we wanted to say like this only occurred, this change only occurred between the respiration, I don't want it being included in the level changes. One technique we can do is we can actually use these functions here to spline or extend the data. So if we take our high cursor, we could say something like, at this point, really for the rest of the segment, the change in skin conductance level is due to the respiration. Well, let's just extend across and not include it. So right away, a lot of people might be thinking like, well, how do we know that that's the level? What about the activity that occurred? It's really not returning down that baseline. How long did that take? These are all compounds, and they're just inherent in editing the data this way. So normally we recommend staying away from that if possible, right? Because we don't know what we could be doing with the data exactly. It's also the case here that we could be having something like this could be an astral SCR if it were a little bit larger. And so then we have to somehow account for that and such as splining across. How do we match that point? It just becomes difficult, right? So using the splining function is do that as little as possible, only in specific instances. Try to do that, less than 40% for a segment. This would be over that, from 3 to 420. So not a good application for an extend in this case, but just want to kind of get everyone aware of that, and we can look at it a little bit deeper in just a second. Another thing that can occur here is that we have a signal dropout. So this can be such as like the sensors actually came off the participant hands temporarily, they were put back on, and then the signal came back into place. So this can look something like this right here. So I'm actually going to remove this data to sort of artificially create what could be a signal dropout. And in these cases, it's normally more apparent that this occurs because we just have this straight line going down to 0 or even a negative number, and then it comes kind of straight back up. So in this case, these are normally more easily identifiable, but the sort of analysis treatment, again, would be to go into our editor. We're going to usually focus a little bit closer around that potential issue here. And then we can take our X cursors and really put the landmarks of right before it was about to drop off and then right before that came back. So once we have defined that window, we can actually use the splining feature to connect those 2 points on a normal distributed line, and then we can kind of move forward there. Okay, and I am running just a few minutes behind here, but we are going to just continue on here. I'm going to save my edit files so we can all have that afterwards. And then we'll just open up the Q&A in about 10 minutes after I get through these examples here. Okay, so going into the next file, we'll actually look at some messy data, how we would handle that. So in example one, I'm going to load that. I've already mapped my skin conductance channel here. We will notice that there isn't any respiration here. So if you remember, then in these cases, we would recommend not reporting on skin conductance responses or SCRs. And also the sort of tonic period is something you would not want to use. So hitting the analysis here, we can look at this waveform. So if we were to see something like this, this is that sort of jaggedness that I was talking about, comparing that to the sort of slow rolling hills that we are not expecting. So in these cases here, this can be indicative of motion artifact, which is likely this first triangle wave, and then just not having great connectivity with the sensors. So this could be you didn't have them wash their hands before you put them on, or the sensors are dried out. Things like that can make this line a little bit more jagged. It can also be the case that it's just auto scaling, and this is likely what's occurring here. So our program, what it'll do is it'll show you the entire amplitude of the waveform. And if there's not a lot of change, it's really zoomed in, right? So no matter, I mean, if you really zoom in on anything, it'll start to lose its sort of contour definition. And the range here is just that. It's 3.1 up to 3.3. So it's only 200ths of a change in the actual amplitude. And so that's why it looks like this. So when you see something like this, it's not like there's inherently an issue with it. Just look at the range. And if it's something, very small change in here that's only a couple tenths or hundredths of a change between the two, that's probably what's occurring. So I would recommend looking forward to see if this continues to occur for this person. Do we actually see a segment in which we see any phasic change? Yes, we do. So later on here, we can actually see that they went from that area where they were around that baseline, and then we had an SCR that really changed the range, now going from 0 all the way to 8.5. So quite a bit difference in range that we saw there. And then, lo and behold, we actually see that normal sort of slow rolling hill structure that we expect. So that would then give me the sort of confidence to come back and say, this is fine. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just the range level. Why these are not being identified as SCRs is because that minimum threshold that we set before is not being reached for these. So when we actually look at the editor, we can see this a little bit closer if we needed to. We could put the first one here at that trough location and then here at the peak. And in this case, we can look at the Y delta to look at the absolute time between. I'm sorry, the amplitude between them, and we can see that 0.05 was our minimum. So this is only 0.03, so that is why this is not being identified as an SCR. So again, another thing you can look at here is this segment here. So this is going to be somewhat common, especially in your baseline and recovery periods. So those instances in which we don't expect, or there would be an expectation here that they're going to have less sort of those sympathetic activation periods. So when you see something like this is, again, like, let's look forward. Let's make sure at some point we have some data that makes sense to us in which we're expecting those different changes. But looking at that, we already did, right? We saw that level change. There is an SCR. This is just typical of someone that is having that sort of sympathetic withdrawal, at least at the level of the organ of the skin. And so this sort of straight line ish that's going from this second quadrant down to 4 is typical again in those cases. So it's not something where the data are bad. It just can occur in some participants. So again, for this person, they're sort of just chilling out, not having a lot of that phasic or sympathetic activation. And then all of a sudden we do see some change here. So yeah, anyways, there's something to be aware of that's not super common, but it can happen again in those different components of your study. Last thing we'll see here on this segment is that there is a dropout, sort of, what I talked about before is this straight line, a very, very, jagged, sort of straight coming down. As we looked at the different responses before, it should be this very slow moving up and down architecture here. So this right here is very typical of the signal dropping off. So typically the sensor being temporarily taken off the skin. Now, in this case here, we can see that there's a skin conductor response that occurs right at the end, and that's great. There's no problem with it. And then we have a dropout that occurs right afterwards. So again, I would zoom into this area to define that window a little bit better for us. And from that point here, what I would recommend is that we actually do an extend feature that we saw before. In a previous example, it was extending like 70% of the segment, which we don't want to do. But in this case, it's not a lot of data that we would be estimating. So it's safer to do this function of right before it drops off, we're going to extend the right from the high cursor, the high being the one to the right. This is now the low. And but we're going to extend across, and then now we can have a more accurate mean skin consensus level without that sort of change. Now, in so doing these kinds of things, we just want to be aware that if we are doing SCRs, like let's really try to minimize the amount of time that we're extending or extrapolating, estimating these data, so that we don't dramatically underestimate SCRs. Um, and it's also the case that we might want to consider that tonic information and whether we're going to use it or not. But again, for mean skin consensus level, this sort of procedure up to about 40% of a segment is normally safe to do. Okay, and I am saving these edit files for everybody. So following the webinar, we're going to send you a copy of all these edit files. You'll get the video, of course, and the PowerPoint that I actually used. So you can kind of follow along afterwards. Okay, I'm going to go into an example here. Okay, so yet another sort of naming convention that people have done here. So just really showing the fact that we want to probably standardize what we're calling skin conductance. But in this case here, we have our skin conductance collection, and then in this case, this is identified as respiration, so a respiration belt, and so we would map it as such. We're going to go into this actual session here, and we're looking at 60-second segments. So in this case, let's assume that we do want to look at skin conductance responses. We can see here that there's a lot of them, and we sort of see these low-level sort of compound SCRs that are occurring here, at least this white one. And over here, we see these occurring here. Normally, with these kinds of things, we don't see the skin conductance level change, drop back down, and then have a small rise afterwards. This sort of structure that occurring here is usually indicative of messy data that is being passed through. So in these cases, this is a recommendation I would certainly reach out to MindWare to look at, but we can see, oh, we're actually sampling at 1,000 hertz here. So we want to match our block size with that collection there. And then you can see that it's going to remove a couple of those that are just, sort of being identified just because of the sampling and block change. But we just still have these structures afterwards. So I'm not saying these are not impossible, they're not impossible or anything, they're just not as likely that they would occur. Normally when we see a compound SCR, it's such that it is occurring before the half recovery point. So just something to kind of be aware of, that it could be the quality of the data we're collecting. And it looks like within our respiration, we're also seeing some jaggedness that is not our sort of normal respiratory cycles. So could just be indicative of a inadequate acquisition hardware, or again, one of those potential compounds of not having them wash their hands, or a lot of motion artifact. So one thing to just look at here, just besides the actual morphology, which looks more normal here, is the level change here. So as far as ranges that we would expect, most of these are going to be between 2 and 20 microsiemens for humans. And as far as a reportable range, that's usually 0.5 to 35. So that upper end of really anything but above 20 to 35, I really start to question, if there's something else occurring here, again, like that we didn't wash their hands, or potentially that we used the wrong sensors. So if someone were to use an ECG sensor, let's say on the hand, that has a much higher conductance increase on the ECG ones, and so it's going to just amplify all of our skin conductance to a much higher range. If this is done, the data are unfortunately unusable because it's not a constant increase that's occurring here as their baseline is floating. So be aware of these. Let's try not to use the wrong sensors on these for sure. But it is possible still, by using the correct sensors, that we see this kind of change. And this is in a lot of cases just due to someone that maybe could have something like hyperhidrosis, right? Just extremely profusely sweating. Okay, great. So just something to be aware of here. Again, not saying that this is not usable data, but it is certainly messier with a lot of SCRs that are occurring in here. So something to be aware of. One other thing you'll see here is if let's pretend in this case where you looking to report an SCRs. So one thing that can occur on some segments is that we actually have an SCR that is bridging here potential between segments. And in this case, it's actually picking up on the trough, which is very likely not the actual trough location. So it's probably over here that is then rising up. But as far as this window, it sees that trough and begins that sort of point here. So um, underestimating SCRs, change in the tonic level, these are all things that can occur by having just this windowing function. So another strategy would be that instead of these 60-second segments, we can look at, let's say, entire condition. So in this case here, I can look at the entire file of 477 segments for this, and then we can see all of our SCRs across the screen here, and then we won't have to worry about any specific changes or SCRs that are not being identified because of the actual segmentation of the 60-second intervals. It does make the data a little bit harder to handle and identify the different points. We will very likely have to go into the editor to make that sort of correlation for those, the differences between respiration artifacts and not. But it is certainly doable. So in reporting on SCRs, this is a nice way in which we can ensure, again, that the segmentation is not causing problems for us. Okay, great. So I think the next thing to do is to go into the last example, and then we'll go ahead and open up the Q&A. A little bit behind here again, but we will spend a little extra time answering questions if necessary. So again, I've mapped my channels correctly here, and we're going to go ahead and start to analyze these data sets. And I'm actually going to change my window back to 60 seconds. Okay, so what I'm looking to do here is that just exemplifying the event-related SCRs. So as we can see in the bottom right here, we have a total count, which is the non-specific SCR. So those are those that are not due to an event because they fall outside of that 1 to 3 second window. And then we do have the event-related section here. So going through here, we can actually see that most of these are being picked up on as non-specific, and that is because we are in time mode. So if we were to switch this again to something that might be more helpful for us, we can actually say, let's just use all of these events, just for example, that we want to occur on the screen. So now here's my event of that section, and this is still saying that it is not event related because it doesn't fall within that 1 to 3 second window. So again, 1 to 3 seconds afterwards, we don't see that change. But as we go through here, we can see, again, this one right here being too close, right? So that trough not taking a second before it occurs. But as we go through here, we can actually see if any of these will line up within that window. And here we go. So here's an actual event occurs. Then a little bit more than a second later, we see this change. And so now this specific one here that you can see is being identified as an event-related response. So that is how that kind of component works with it all. Okay, so I think at this point here, that's all of the prepared examples I have. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at our question page for those of you that have sent them through. Really quick to just look at the question, then I'll throw in an answer. So anybody has any additional questions, please feel free to enter them now while I'm just reading this really briefly. Okay, so we have just a question of like how to identify good skin conductance data. So I hope that through the different things I've talked about since this was put in, it might help you a little bit more on identifying those few. So, but looking at the level changes, that's the kind of the first thing to look at because there could be something like the actual application just auto scaling, zooming in and kind of creating that issue that we looked at in example one. It can be that the jaggedness of the line, even after we've corrected for the sampling rate, that can be, indicative of something like a lot of motion artifact. But normally in this structure, if we see something like this, just visually, like not template matching in a certain sense, but if we're seeing these sort of slow moving structural changes in that sort of normal 2 to 20 microsiemen range, then that's usually just a good identifier that these are good quality data. And I'm just going to read the next question here. Okay, so it's as far as just outputting the data structure here. So the question is, can we output to the specific folders? Yes, but then can we also output to these to a single folder for the entire session? So all the participant output files go into one folder here. You certainly can do this. Yeah, within the additional settings here, we do have an output settings function. So the default directory, this is going to create that output file underneath that specific person's folder, but we can say that we're going to turn that off, and then it'll come up and ask you simply, where do you want all of the outputs to be saved? After this is done, and again, with most of the things here, calibration, settings, events, I'd recommend saving a configuration for that study. And then in the analysis routine would be, we're going to open the application, open the file, we're going to map our channels, and then the very next thing I would have the experimenter do is open the configuration for that study. That'll ensure that they're using the correct events and modes, the calibration settings are constant, and then also that the additional settings such as that output directory is the same for all the different sessions that occur. Okay, and then just 1 second while I read the next one. Yeah, so there's a question here about essentially if we're able to use skin depth responses, both non-specific, or sorry, event-related and non-specific on segments of varying lengths. So between 20 and 60 seconds on a single subject. So yes, you could definitely do this. After that, though, we do need to consider the amount of time allowed for your SCRs to occur here. So what we don't want to do is we don't want to let our windows like sort of overlap on each other, so we're using the same data twice, if you will. So as long as we're controlling for that, such as there's 20 seconds that occur here and there's a separate 60 seconds that occur afterwards, that's fine. But we don't want, like, again, sort of sharing the same time and data. But one thing you can do here to make this easier on you is depending on the event state that you have, like, do we have events coming through from a stimulus presentation program automatically? Do we have the experimenter hitting event keys if we're using MindWare? Were they actually putting event keys in there for different components? Um, or do we need to add the events afterwards? So if we actually go into the section here, we can see that what we can do is we can actually export these events. There are a couple different support articles on our support site to help you create these event files manually, but I will go through this really quickly here. So we're going to do the export in absolute time. So this is just relative to the beginning of experiment, so time 0. Relative being time of day, if you are interested in some sort of circadian sort of effects on the physiology. But in this case, we're going to do just the absolute time. And so if I go now into my webinar folder here that you'll get, I believe I'm on example 3 here. So I just did that output of the events here. So in this case here, what we can do is if we needed to, we can actually come in here. This is a tab delimited file, so there's no spaces, so be aware of that. But we can actually come in here and we can manually put in times of the different events that occur. So we could actually say that this one was something from like 5, or I'm sorry, from the 4:59 up to something like 5:15. And when we put that in here, I'm actually going to just load this specific one here for that change here. So start drawing video, and then we're going to say something like smaller window. And now I can save this, and I can just essentially load that event file by hitting add, MindWare event file that we just created. It found that file because it was underneath that same participants folder. Of course, that wasn't the case. You could uncheck that and say where your event file is located. But we're going to load it back into absolute time here. And then we can say here that we had that smaller window. actually forgot to put in the time correctly here. But the idea here would be then that we could do something like an event source or event. So event source pulling from this table up here. This is nice because when it sorts automatically between participants, it'll only pay attention to the time, or I'm sorry, the title. Whereas event will look at the both the name and the timing to sort them. But anyways, I'm going to do event here, and the idea would be that we can do something like the start of baseline to, I'm just going to pick the end of baseline because the time doesn't make sense. And then we could also look at something like the start of the baseline to something that occurs way later, right? This is the thing that we want to be careful though. So this would be our smaller segment that we're looking at. This would be the larger one. So I think the question was based off 20 and 60-second segments. But they do share some time, right? That's occurring here. So if we want that, then that's great. But if otherwise, we'll probably want to, look at the analysis in a little bit different of a way. And I'm just going to read through a couple more of these. This is a question here about if we're able to access the recording later. So yes, definitely we'll send you a link to that. It'll be um, in sort of the Thinkific folder that you all signed up for within that location. All these different resources will be available there. It'll also be posted on our YouTube channel and directly on our support site under the resources. So yes, you definitely will. And then we have a question here about just how many SCRs can there be in a segment? And yeah, just kind of get an example of those. So based off of the segment 3 is where this is coming from. There isn't an exact limit of SCRs that can occur within a segment. Usually something, if I'm looking at a 60-second segment, um, when I'm seeing something above like 15 to 20 SCRs, this is kind of when I might want to look at this a little bit closer, such as do I have the correct sampling rate? Is it occurring there? But there's really not a complete limit that can occur here. It's just that that would be a normal, outlier, something like above 15. Um, but really, focusing on respiration as well, like if they're breathing rapidly and heavily, that could induce a lot of those SCRs. So we might need to, analyze that in a different way. But yeah, something in that range is normally where we start to look a little bit closer. Are we in the correct range over on the Y here? Things like that. And okay, so I think that's most of the questions here. Let me just run through this and double check one more time. Mhm. Okay, I guess that's all I have been fed so far. So if anybody has any last minute questions here, please feel free to shoot them through here. Otherwise, we will go ahead and conclude the webinar. Um, and one thing before we go into that is you will be getting a post-webinar survey. Please do fill that out. That helps us, certainly make these better. So it's just a couple questions really quick if you have the time available. Also, by filling that out, you will get a certificate of completion for attending the webinar. So that can be nice as well. Um, but okay, so I still haven't received anything, so I'm going to go ahead and assume everyone doesn't have any questions here. I've done a great job of presenting, so there's no questions, which is awesome. So thank you for attending, and if anybody has anything that they sort of questions that came up later, please feel free to reach out to our support team, and we'll be happy to answer this for you. So thank you for everybody attending, and hopefully you can make our next session on blood pressure variability. And it's going to be in September, so hopefully I can see everybody there. All right, take care.